Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Kate Mondlock, an Assistant Professor of Contemporary Art History and Theory. Kate Mondlock earned her B.S. at the School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. She earned her M.A. and Ph.D. in Art History from UCLA. She came to the University of Oregon in 2005. Her research interests include media art and theory, digital culture, contemporary art, and theories of spectatorship and subjectivity. She is working on a book manuscript entitled Screen Subjects, Media Art and Screen Spectatorship. Thank you so much for being with us, Kate.
Thank you.
And welcome to Oregon again. I guess you've been here since 2005, but you know.
But I'm back.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So how did you get from the School of
Foreign Service
at Georgetown to the study of art history?
Well, I'd say the turning point was, first of all, after 2 years of grueling microeconomic theory, I had some indication that perhaps that wasn't going to be my future. But really, more than that, there was a fantastic class I took in Russian art history, just by chance. I was studying Russian political systems at the time. And the class really opened my eyes to a new way of looking at history. I suddenly realized it doesn't have to be political history. It could be cultural history. And it can be just as informative, if not, in my opinion, more informative. So that was the turning point.
That was the turning point. So, and now tell me what your obligations are in the art history department.
So as the teacher of contemporary art and theory, I'm basically responsible for teaching courses in post-war, so post-World War II, post-1945 art and theory. I also teach one large lecture class in art of the Western world from 1600, but my main responsibilities include, post-war art.
And so, and tell me, just give us an idea, because there may be people out here who want to sit in on your classes or take your classes. Tell us the names of your courses.
I teach, okay, let's start from the beginning. So I teach a class in art since 1945. That's the basic kind of grounding course, which students really like a lot, coming from all kinds of disciplines, because they get a taste of what is going on in that era of art, things that you see maybe on TV or you hear about and you don't really know what's going on, but it's not so hyper intensive that they get, turned off. It's a really great class. And then I also teach a class called Art Since 1980, Issues in Art and Theory Since 1980. It's generally filled with art students the first day of registration, so we have to kind of jam the other students in the door some other way. They're really anxious, obviously, as practitioners, to learn this kind of thing. I teach a course in art of the 1960s and 70s, which is a fantastic way to learn about contemporary art in general, because so much of the most important production was basically initiated in the 60s and 70s. And then I teach a series of graduate seminars on lots of different topics, but especially between art and media.
So what do you like best? What do you like to teach best so far?
I really love the graduate seminars because I like getting to know the students. Most of my classes are at least 30 students, whereas the seminars tend to be maybe 15. And we get to, of course, explore topics really in depth, but all of them are great. I really think there's nothing quite like having someone's eyes open up and see art for the first time, especially contemporary art, which can be really challenging and maybe even offensive to people before they learn more about it.
So tell me about your own research, what it's about, and what really hooked you into it.
The hooking point came from one of my advisors at UCLA. As an art historian, it's somewhat funny to say that my two closest advisors were actually architectural theorists rather than art historians, although they worked in the art history department. So one of them, we were in close conversation, and we just sort of knocked upon this idea of the screen one day, and what is going on with the screen, whether in architecture, art,
the
whatever.
The screen. Okay.
Yeah. He actually was referring more to the screen in terms of architecture, but I took it a slightly different way.
So you want to tell our audience what's meant by the screen in architecture?
Well, by that he meant a trend in digital architecture toward using actual scrims for sort of projection surfaces that also work as walls. Okay. So there's a sort of collapse between what is a wall and what is a screen. But his interests are then somewhat, subsidiary to the what I'm interested in are the use of media screens. So by that I mean film, computer, video screens in art practice. So in other words, artworks made with these kinds of screens. I'm doing a spectatorship study, which is to say, I'm studying what kind of viewing regimes these works impose, if you will. How do they ask us to see them, and how is that different from other kinds of art?
So give us a very concrete example of what you mean.
Okay, so for example, one of my favorite works is by an artist named Valley Export. She made a project in 1972 called, actually 1968, I'm sorry, called Ping Pong. And it is a wall in the gallery. It's just the actual wall. She takes a film projector and projects onto the wall a film of a ping pong ball coming back and forth. Then there is a table against the wall, a ping pong paddle, and a ball. Your job as the viewer is to go and play against this imaginary opponent, the screen-based opponent. So what I think is so fascinating about this, I mean, aside from the issue that having a media screen in a gallery is somewhat strange to begin with, is that it is a material interaction between the viewer and the screen. So it is something that that you're not simply looking into the screen as we do in everyday life. We just look into TVs, we look at films and so on. You're actually physically engaging with it in I think, a provocative way.
When does interacting with it, we were speaking earlier about an artist who's coming who is talking about how we have so much simulated reality today that people may, and the simulations are sometimes so even caring that they may be more caring than actual human beings. What about the screen and the question of reality and one's ethical relation, to the world?
Well, that's exactly what I'm interested in. To the extent that this is an art historical study, my primary project is to talk about this, let's say, new form of art practice. But the secondary project, and my true pet interest, if the truth be told, is in what does it mean that the nature of our relationships are defined by screen interfaces so much? We spend our days with PDAs, with computers, with we mediate our relationships through MRI screens. I heard a great example on NPR the other day of fighter pilots in Iraq who are logging 9 to 5 hour jobs in a Nevada training station. They come in, punch in the clock, drop bombs from their computer in Nevada, and go home.
And that's the Iraq War?
Yeah. And so those kinds of issues, I think, are just extremely provocative to think about. And so while I don't pretend to be an expert in all these kinds of screen interfaces, I can look at these sort of evocative examples, let's say, of the screen interfaces in a museum setting and extrapolate from there.
Well, let me kind of push this just a bit now. So it sounds like you have these, possibly there are ethical qualms about it.
Yes.
And yet that's your work. In other words, your work is devoted to these screens and to this, let's call it rather ephemeral art and art that's sort of interactive art. So how do you both teach a subject lovingly, like the old-fashioned art historians, I just love Rembrandt and so on.
Right.
And yet your relationship to your subject matter is more complicated than that. So how do you negotiate that?
I'm a loving critic. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah.
I think that I tend to teach, yes, what I love, but most of the things that I love, intellectually speaking, are things that provoke me, things that make me even angry on some level, and I want to understand them more. So I hope that's a decent answer.
I think that's a very good answer.
Okay.
So give us some other ideas. So you've got the ping pong thing, which sounds fantastic. I mean,
of course you can never win, right? So you were never in charge.
Yes.
It's always that other behind the screen.
Does it actually help? I mean, in people's skills?
Apparently
in getting
not.
better at ping pong? No?
I don't know. I don't know how long you're allowed to stay in the gallery ping-ponging away, so it's hard to say.
I see. And give us some other ideas of some of the other things you look at, because after all, if this is your subject, there must be vast numbers of examples.
There's an inordinate number of examples. In fact, if you go into any contemporary museum today, the chances that you will not run into a screen-reliant artwork within the first 5 minutes are slim to none. And this is also a pretty remarkable change from only 30 years ago. But in any event, another example.
Yeah, just one more, I think, be fine.
Douglas Gordon has a work called 24-Hour Psycho. It is an enormous screen, and it's it is a screen in which you can see it on both sides. I always forget the name of how that works, but you know, it's transparent, so you can see it on both sides. And it is the movie Psycho played out over 24 hours. So the screen itself assumes a sort of objectivity, a sort of, it seems like almost a sculpture in the space. That's all there is, this screen. A little bit larger than you and I, but the actual film is played out for 24 hours. So it's excruciating to watch. You anticipate what might happen. You don't really know what's going on. It's another thing I'm really interested in is the temporality of receiving these works. Typically, when we experience screen media, they are setting the time constraints, let's say. A film has a certain length. A television program has a certain length. These artworks, by virtue of being in the gallery space, allow you to come in and out whenever you want to. So it's a really different kind of negotiation of media.
Now we have about a minute and a half left.
Okay.
But you say you're going to teach this course in art from 1600 to the present.
Yes.
This idea of sort of interaction in art, interactive art, is probably, there must be earlier examples of it, even in the 16th century, or even in the 17th century, beginning in the. So are you going to talk about that in your class, and if so, can you give us one example of that?
Well, I do talk about those kinds of things in my class. Let's see what.
Of course, you haven't taught it yet. You're teaching it in the spring.
I taught it once before. I'll be teaching it in the spring. One thing, this is slightly different than what you've actually asked, but one thing that I try and draw out throughout the course as a sort of thematic is the role of perspective in training our vision in certain ways. So there is perspective all of a sudden shows up right after in the Renaissance. So this idea that there's a single point in space, in case the audience isn't totally familiar.
Sure.
And this radically changes the way that we view and experience art and indeed the world. So I try and draw students' attention all the time to how these artworks are asking us to see the world differently, not just to see it, but how do they then transform us, really, as viewers.
Through perspective that people first begin to understand as a sort of an artful intervention rather than something that we just take for granted.
Right. Otherwise, students tend to come assuming that, exactly, it's something taken for granted. We don't analyze the fact that it just simply didn't exist for all intents and purposes until the Renaissance.
So let me just put you on the spot here in the last 20 or 30 seconds. Who's your favorite painter?
Painter?
Yes.
Oh, you have to say that.
Or artist. Just go ahead. Just who's the real model for you? And you don't even have to explain it. We'll just leave the audience to think about it.
Let's see. Well, I already said Valley Export, so I guess that doesn't
Valley
count.
Export.
How about also Pipilotti Rist? I really like quite a bit. Pipilotti Rist, a video artist who I've been thinking about recently.
Excellent. Okay. Well, everybody, he?
She.
Again, the name?
Swiss. Pipilotti Rist.
Pipilotti Rist. Think about her. Kate Mondluck, it's been excellent having you with us. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
And we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to UO Today. Our next guest is Deborah Hurt, an assistant professor in the Department of Art History in the School of Architecture and Allied Arts. Deborah Hurt earned her BA at Williams College, her master's and her PhD in architectural history at the University of Virginia. She came to Oregon in 2003. Her research focuses on 20th century architecture in France between World War I and World War II. She's currently working on a book manuscript entitled Contested Territory, Architecture and Modernity in Interwar France. Well, I'm glad that we finally have the chance to talk on the show. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So give our audience just a kind of an idea of where what you do fits into the curriculum of art history.
In our department here at the U of O, we have, it's actually one of the few departments in the country that has architectural history as a real strength. We're approximately a third of the department. And so I work primarily in 20th century and, if you will, international, European, but international architecture. And then we have Leland Roth, who teaches largely American, 19th century, a little bit of 18th and 20th, and then Richard Sunt, who teaches medieval. So we're sort of a side to the other art historians who will concentrate primarily on painting and sculpture or various disciplines that, various texts sometimes that relate to those. So in some ways also we're a bit of a bridge between art history and the architecture department in terms of a lot of the students that we teach are learning to become architects rather than historians. So in some ways we're very much a bridge within the school in terms of humanities and a more professional approach.
So is architecture generally taught, the history of architecture in most departments of art history in the country?
It really varies, which again was why for me this particular situation is perfect. Because it's both within a humanities department, which is where my thinking comes from and where my heart and soul is, but it is also within the creativity of doing design, which I love and has also been part of my background in terms of being in those kinds of worlds. It's sometimes in art history departments, it often gets taught sort of as a second component of a design curriculum, but that generally doesn't offer a sense of really being able to pursue history in depth. So in general, it's within an art history department. The program at Virginia was unusual in that it's its own department completely of architectural history. So in that sense, we were able to pursue it with a real depth.
On an architecturally very distinguished campus.
Yes.
Virginia. Well, we'll get there. And what particularly drew you to the study of architecture from a historical perspective?
Oh, it's a life story for me, really. My father was trained as an architect.
I see.
Designed the house that I grew up in. So it was always a part of my world, some sense of design and the physical environment that I lived in. I asked for years, did I want to become an architect? And there's various reasons why I didn't quite come to that point. I remember actually being at an exhibit of the work of Louis Kahn in Philadelphia, who's one of the most famous American architects after World War II, up into roughly the 70s. We were at an exhibit of his work, and a friend who's an architect asked me, did I want to build? And I think that was a very pivotal question, because I think I concluded not necessarily. I think I've really begun to see gradually or grow into the sense of my better contribution, or the spirit of who I am, is more about interpreting architecture, helping others to see it and interpret it and respond to it, and not necessarily to be making architecture. So that's, I think in that sense, that's how I see myself as an historian, as an interpreter, helping others to know how to think about it.
Tell me about the kind of classes you teach. I'm sure our audience out there would be interested in sitting in. So give me a sense of what you teach.
I teach a real range. The main course I teach is a survey in which I introduce people to architecture from the Renaissance all the way up to the present, which in 10 weeks could also be called the greatest hits, or some. It's very quick but it gives people basic tools in which to begin to think about architecture. The rest of my courses are 20th century based. Some more focused in sort of modern areas, such as a seminar on Le Corbusier, or a course that might be thematic. I teach a seminar called Architecture in the Museum. Another thematic course of a different ilk altogether is a course on architecture and the postmodern, and how do those connect, and how don't they connect, and why does that matter? So that really brings up a more cultural phenomenon, and how does architecture fit there? One really fun course I teach is on the Pritzker Prize winners, which the Pritzker Prize, as some may know, is often considered the Nobel Prize of architecture, or the equivalent. And it's been a wonderful way to explore some of the most well-known architects in the past almost 30 years.
Are there any lemons in that group?
Are there any lemons? There are a few. I have to be careful about how I talk about that.
Maybe we shouldn't get it. Maybe we should.
There's a few
These people may know.
Certainly a few that surprised me.
Yeah.
And there are some that, what I think is a strength about the prize is they certainly nominate and choose some stars, but they also look a little bit more deeply and pick out some figures that have not been well known, and in drawing attention to some work that's of a superior quality that is overlooked. So there's a real range, actually.
So do students who are studying architecture in the and who are studying to be architects come talk to you after class and tell you about what they're working on?
Yeah, some. And I love that. Again, I'm working in a different realm for them,
right?
And how they take it. I mean, one thing I should talk to them probably more about how do they think about history, or to what degree does what they do in a history class percolate over into studio in ways, from my point of view, hopefully more than just using the form of a building to create another form, which I think is such a tiny piece. I mean, in other words, I hope history percolates through to them more than just something visual, but a whole way of thinking about who they are and how they think about architecture. But I've had students sometimes come to me working on a studio project and just want to brainstorm some ideas, and sometimes want to get out of architecture language, so they'll come to me because I speak a slightly different language than they do, and that's kind of fun and hopefully helpful to them.
Well, let's get into the area of your own research, which is a very specific area between World War I and World War II.
Right.
What the modern is, how that interacts with the regional. Give me an idea of how this interest hooked you.
It became more specific, I would say, when I was working on my master's thesis. But I grew up with a love. I grew up knowing modern architecture. I grew up in the era when modern architecture was the architecture, and that was a bit, of the world of my family, and I loved that. But then I began to encounter some problems with that as the literature beginning in the 60s, but as I began to encounter it in the 80s, said, wait a minute, there's some problems here.
What were the problems?
That some aspects of a very pure modern architecture can be cold, can be very anonymous and very dull to look at, and therefore can have, for example, some very, very oppressive social ramifications. And there are cases of that in which that was not necessarily proven, but documented in such ways that the banality of a building was a fuel to sort of crime and social unrest. One example in St. Louis in the 70s. As in the aspects of what was called the modern were not all just about beauty and elegance and exciting newness. That's part of it, but that wasn't the whole story. As I began to see that, it generated lots of questions. Very interested in Scandinavian modernism, because that approach to the modern was always a little gentler or more human, nature-based than some of the more well-known modern architecture from, for example, Germany and France. But then as I began my thesis, I realized, wait a minute, I'm not about to start to learn the Finnish language, and French was what I knew, and I was amazingly surprised to work with an iconic modernist and discover him running up against these, in the story that I discovered, real arch traditionalists working at the very same time. And I'd never heard of that.
And you're speaking of Le Corbusier?
Le Corbusier, it being a very well-known, or one of the most well-known figures of modernist architecture, and certainly the most well-known if you think about France.
Well, who would our audience recognize a particular building or monument?
Building of his, oh gosh, maybe. One of the most famous is called the Villa Savoie, a house he built outside of Paris, completed in about 1930.
Right.
There's another big apartment complex in the south of France called the Unité d'Habitation that is not particularly attractive to our eyes today, but still remains a very popular place to live and is also one of his more famous buildings.
So what about the tension between regionalism and modernism? How do you work that out?
Well, what I encountered in working on this first project that then ended up growing into my dissertation was I encountered this idea of the regionalist movement, which in retrospect is very obvious, but I didn't know about it at the time. And what came out about this movement, or in my own discovery, was that concurrently to the rise of these people that were pushing for what was new and very crisp and lean, but sometimes banal, et cetera, were other people that were pushing for something that was much more grounded in the earth and in the time period that I was looking at. Some of that became associated with a groundedness that had racist overtones, for example, nationalistic overtones, and in other words, not that far from the discourse that we know more about in Germany, but which was in fact very present in France as well, and also in Italy, other European countries in different ways. But I began to realize that a whole counter-movement was going on alongside that of the avant-garde. And what's interesting me now is the sense, so the avant-garde didn't work in isolation, which is generally the only story we've been told. All there was the avant-garde. In fact, the avant-garde was a very small piece, and regionalism and other more traditional approaches were much more common. So it made me ask, what's the real story, for one thing? What matters? And if this other architecture is so dominant, how then do I think about the avant-garde, which is all I've ever known? And I think what I've since become extremely interested in is, I think, the fact that the two movements were concurrent but did not operate in isolation, that in fact they dialogued with each other, and I would suggest now that they really influenced each other. So now I've come to the sense that if we're going to understand the avant-garde properly, we need to understand these other people anyway, even if we might not like them as well. But that in fact the discourse between them is very, not only is it very dynamic and extremely sort of juicy material, but it's
really what was going on.
It's what was going on, and I also think, and which I find fascinating, that describes what was going on, what's going on today in our world. These nature of our conflicts, whatever realm they might be in.
Well, Deborah, it sounds like a very original view of modernism, and we look forward to this work being disseminated and proudly associated with the University of Oregon. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
And we've been speaking with Deborah Hurt, Assistant Professor in the Department of Art History. Thank you for watching.